A very warm welcome to another session of A Closer Look. Today I have two wonderful guests that I'd like to speak to about business and human rights, a topic that is becoming more and more important and more spoken about in the Middle East and North Africa. Let me introduce both of them to you just very briefly. Welcome, Christelle Basile and Dr. Damilola Olawuhi. Thank you both for being here with us, with me today. A brief introduction. Professor Dr. Damilola Olawuhi is a professor and UNESCO chairholder on environmental law and sustainable development at the College of Law at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha, Qatar. He holds a doctorate in energy and environmental law from the University of Oxford and has a Master of Laws from Harvard and from the University of Calgary, and is admitted as a barrister and solicitor in Canada and Nigeria. That's one thing all three of us have in common. All three of us are lawyers. He has practiced and taught law all over the world, pretty much in every continent, as I found out. He's published close to 100 articles, book chapters, and books, predominantly on petroleum law, energy, and international environmental law. He serves on the executive committees and boards of several organizations, one being, for example, the International Law Association, where he's the vice chair. But most interestingly for us today, he's also a member of the working group of the UN Business and Human Rights, so the working group on business and human rights of the United Nations. Dr. Damilola, and I get to call you Damilola, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Christelle Basile, you're a senior expert with XAPA, a Paris-based consultancy in business, human rights, and sustainability, providing consultancy services to both the private and public sectors globally, but you focus particularly on the MENA region, the region we want to speak about today. You have expertise in conducting due diligence, performing impact assessments, and training organizations to integrate these principles of business and human rights into their operations. You, as I've mentioned, are also a practicing lawyer, and you've practiced in the MENA region, so you bring a strong understanding of the evolving legal landscape, and you've successfully navigated complex issues with various stakeholders. You're a member of the Beirut Bar Association, which I know very well. I get to call Beirut my home, and so it's lovely to have you also there with us in this regard. And you've worked as a lawyer in international arbitration and human rights. You have a bachelor from MUSEC, also from Lebanon, and a master's from the SOAS University of London. Previously, you worked with the Syrian Legal Development Program, which is where we sort of met, and especially now, you know, it's an exciting time with everything that's happening in Syria. But there's a lot going on in the business and human rights world as well. And the two of you have just met now at the end of November in Geneva at the big forum on business and human rights. And that's also sort of the reason we're having this conversation. And to dive in, you know, quite quickly, I'd like to very generally start by asking you, Christelle, you know, what is business and human rights? I think when we speak about human rights, we have an idea, but business and human rights, you know, can you define that term for us? What does that incorporate?
Absolutely. Thank you. First and foremost, thank you very much, Philip, for this opportunity and for bringing more light into the conversation on business and human rights in the Middle East, which is very timely, but also necessary. So business and human rights in very simple terms is it's a process. So business human rights is not just about identifying something. It's about policy embedding. It's about how businesses and investors respect human rights in their operations, very simply. But what it entails is a process to be put in place. What are the steps that are necessary in this process? First, investors and businesses need to embed responsible business conduct into their operations. By doing so, which is capacity building internally as businesses, but also by adopting policies that are respective of human rights in general. We get many questions saying, okay, what human rights? There isn't, it's all human rights. It's all the human rights that are embedded and enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But We then have to put in place a process called human rights due diligence, where we identify and assess adverse human rights and environmental impacts of certain operations, certain supply chains, and certain business relationships that impact this business or this investor as such. So within this process, when we identify and assess these human rights, we then set in place an action plan to seize and prevent and mitigate these rights. We then track response and collaborate with stakeholders on that. So really, business human rights is all about this. It's all about identifying how, as a business, as an investor, we impact human rights, and how, as a business and an investor, we try to find the ways with which we work with our stakeholders in order to mitigate and remedy in the event of a violation.
Now, Damilola, where does the working group come into this? And the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. I mean, they're not that old yet. I mean, they're a little bit over 10 years. Can you tell us a little bit about these guiding principles, the work of the working group, and sort of their influence on the global business and human rights discussion?
Thank you very much. And I think Crystal provided a very wonderful overview of the business and human rights agenda. And just to take us back a little bit to memory lane, before now, whenever we spoke about human rights, it was generally that we talked about the responsibility of governments. Governments should respect rights, should do this and that. And that was international law back then. But it became clear over time that there are some businesses that are even bigger than some countries. When you look at their budget, when you look at their impact, and when you look at what they control and how they affect human lives. Secondly, when you look at the fact that all of us will spend at least a third of our life in the workplace. If you go to work for 8 hours every day, that is a third of the day. So it was clear that if we don't enjoy human rights in the workplace, then we may never enjoy human rights throughout our lives. And so this realization led the UN Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, to appoint a special representative to look into how we could regulate human rights in the workplace to ensure that businesses advance human rights and we don't just focus on what states should do alone. And so he appointed Professor John Ruggie, now of blessed memory, who developed a comprehensive report on what responsible businesses should do to advance human rights. And that report, after much elaboration, became adopted by the Human Rights Council as a set of norms called the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights. That is the UNGPs. So this was adopted in 2011. And so since 2011, and as part of that adoption process, I think it became clear to at the time that businesses are all over the world, and it may be difficult for one person to oversee the implementation of the guiding principles. So as part of that adoption, the Human Rights Council established a working group on business and human rights. And that working group is made up of 5 independent experts drawn from each regions of the world. And like you said, I am a member of that working group, the member from African states. So we have members from Asia Pacific, from Europe, and from Latin America. And our primary responsibility as the working group is to ensure the dissemination and implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And to answer your question on what exactly do we do, the resolution of the Human Rights Council that appointed us gives us, I would say 5 broad responsibilities. Number 1 is to conduct country visits aimed at assessing the progress made by states and businesses in advancing the UNGPs. And so we conduct at least 2 country visits every year based on the invitation of government. And during those visits, they normally last for about 10 days or more. And after the visit, we normally issue a press statement or have a press conference documenting what we found in that specific country. And we've had about 19 of those visits in the past. The most recent being our visits to Colombia, Argentina and Japan, rather. We've also been to some African countries like Liberia in the recent past. A second aspect of our work is to submit 2 reports every year. One to the Human Rights Council and the other to the UN General Assembly. And these reports normally provide the latest knowledge on a specific topic or theme that we think businesses and states should pay particular attention to. And so you will recall that last year I delivered the report of the working group on the subject of extractive sector, just transition, and human rights. I presented that at the UN General Assembly, the 78th session, and we've had reports on other topics like gender, the responsibility of financial institutions, how states can develop national action plans. So we do 2 reports every year, and all of these reports are available on our website to promote knowledge and awareness on the UNGPs. A third aspect of our work is the communication procedure, whereby, and communication simply means like maybe complaint, whereby anyone, anywhere can send to us a communication on what a business is not doing well in terms of human rights. So this is this business, this is what they have been doing, this is how it affects my right. And normally when we receive those communication, we will contact the necessary parties, and after our initial review of the files, we can then decide when it is appropriate to issue a press statement, maybe saying how we feel about what that particular business should have done better. So, and this has proven to be very effective to provide a voice for the voiceless. A fourth aspect of our work is the sessions, our sessions, and the sessions of the working group simply means our meetings. So the working group meets 3 times a year in Geneva, in February, in May, and in October. And those meetings are very important because during the week, we meet with all stakeholders, civil society, government, business, community. We also even have a public session where anyone can join to tell us what we should be paying attention to. And we normally announce those meetings on our social media page, on our website, to say we are meeting on this date. If you have anything to tell us, join us in this public session. So the sessions are very important. And of course, the fifth and the last aspect of our work is our forum and events. So we have an annual forum. Part of what is included in our resolution, the resolution that established our working group, is that we should organize and chair an annual forum to promote awareness on the UNGPs, to get information on what could be done better. And so we've had that every year since 2011. And so we had just, as you mentioned, we had the latest edition just a few weeks ago in Geneva. And the 13th annual forum from November 25th to 27th, and we're already preparing for the 14th one next year, same last week of November. And so in addition to that annual forum in Geneva, we also have regional level fora that promote awareness. We had the first Arab dialogue on business and human rights, which was held in Doha, Qatar, very recently. So that is the summary of the UNGPs and as well as the working group, what we do.
So now that we've kind of established what business and human rights is and what the working group does, I'd like to focus a little bit more on the Middle East. So let me jump back to you, Christelle. If we look at the Middle East and the region sort of a little bit over 10 years on from the establishment of these guiding principles, how would you say is the Middle East, or is Middle East and North Africa doing? I mean, how are businesses coping with the implementation of these guiding principles? Are businesses in the region generally addressing these human rights issues in their operations and in their supply chains, for example?
Thank you, Philip. So firstly, I would say, unfortunately, the conversation on business and human rights in the Middle East is still lacking. It's still sort of in delay with respects to the rest of the world, so to speak. However, what we notice in practice is that there's many initiatives conducted from UN agencies. For example, we have the ILO that have on the ground work. There's NGOs conducting on the ground groundwork with whether it comes with labor rights or gender rights or any other things. So there's a lot of sort of activities that are happening in silo, and businesses have been involved sort of in a weak manner when it comes to addressing human rights generally in the Middle East. So it's always still, as Dr. Damilola just alluded to, it was always still, we're still in the traditional definition of, okay, human rights are government's business, so to speak. And it's sort of the NGOs that were picking up the pieces on the ground and stakeholders involved to sort of deal with such issues. However, what we're noticing in practice now is that MENA-based, not necessarily Middle Eastern businesses, but MENA-based companies that are sort of affiliates to European or Western companies are responding to the mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence regulations that are being put in place in Europe. And in that sense, we see business and human rights starting to play out in the Middle East. So, for example, we already saw the trend begin with the French duty of vigilance law back in 2017 that required comprehensive human rights due diligence for French companies. And we know that many French companies are already operating in the Middle East, whether in the construction, whether oil and gas, many other sectors as well. We have the Netherlands in 2019, who also issued an obligation to conduct mandatory human rights due diligence with regard to child labor. In 2023, Germany also adopted a supply chain due diligence act that requires German companies to look into the supply chain and engage with suppliers deep in their supply chain. So not just tier one suppliers, but deeper. And this act is already in force, and the first reporting requirements are due in December 2025. What's important to note is that all of these businesses have already started their homework, basically. So they are on the ground in the Middle East, starting to conduct, identify, and map out what are the human rights and environmental risks in their operations in the Middle East. And in that sense, because of this growing legal but also compliance regulations, we also growing in the EU, we also have the comprehensive EU sustainability due diligence, or the CS3D, and the CSRD, which is a reporting obligation, which is coming also into place, is pushing these companies to sort of, conduct sort of this assessment. So I would say, in the absence of a MENA-specific regulation, what is happening is that the EU regulation is spilling out into the MENA operations, and on-the-ground businesses are conducting this due diligence to identify the human rights risks.
I mean, so to separate it a little, of course, we have businesses that are Middle Eastern, right? Yes. So the private sector in Middle East. Then we, of course, have, like you mentioned, European businesses or American businesses that are active in the Middle East. We, of course, have these guiding principles that are global from the United Nations. Of course, we have European laws, that the European enterprises need to abide by. But of course, there's also Middle Eastern laws that the Middle Eastern businesses need to abide by. And you just mentioned that there aren't as many in the Middle East. Damilola, I'd like to ask you, what's your take on this? And while, of course, the private sector needs to do their homework and they need to follow the laws, the governments, of course, are the ones that are responsible for the laws, right? I mean, they have the monopoly on the laws. So what is your assessment of the kind of regulatory circumstance in the Middle East? In your opinion, how are businesses in the Middle East and North Africa abiding by or following these guiding principles and these laws that they have to follow?
Thank you very much, Philippe. I think it's a very, wonderful question. Now, the UNGPs has three pillars. The state duty to protect human rights. The second pillar is the duty of business enterprises themselves to respect, human rights. And the third pillar is for all parties to ensure that they provide access to remedy. That is, whenever there is a wrong, whenever human rights is impacted, there should be remedy. These are the three pillars. And the three pillars, therefore, show the clear responsibility of each party. When we speak to the businesses, you hear them saying, you know, either we're not aware of this or we want to abide, but we don't know what is expected of us. So maybe the state should clarify. You know, when we speak to the state, maybe some stakeholders will say, well, our laws are there, our laws are clear. There is no country in the Middle East that does not have an environmental law. There is no country in the Middle East that does not recognize the need for sustainable development. So the laws are there. Businesses just don't want to be responsible. So it is therefore a question of what should each side do, you know? So when I'm speaking with these stakeholders, I say, yes, I've heard that side. This is your own responsibility. So let me answer that very, very pointedly. The responsibility of states, therefore, is to put in place clear regulations. This is what businesses must do when they are operating here in order to abide by international human rights law. That is what we expect states to do. And that, you know, means having in place either a law or what we call National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And so that is, you know, having a National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights that clarifies what responsible businesses should do when they are operating in their respective territories, it will be the first thing to do. And right now, close to 40 countries across the world now have a National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. But we note that no country in the region has that. So that would be the first thing I think should be done for, you know, the states in the region to start releasing their own national action plan, so that businesses will no longer be able to say, we don't know what is expected of us, you know, because...
Would you say that that is the most pressing issue at the moment in regards to business and human rights?
I think so. That would be a good starting point, and it will be a clear signal that we understand the UNGPs. We want businesses operating here to comply. And the reason why states should be, see this as a priority is that some businesses get away with things they cannot even do in their own country. So you are a business, let's say a business registered in the United States or registered in somewhere else, is able to come to a country, to another country, and get away with things that they are not able to do back home. So providing that clarity to me will be the starting point. And when doing that, what the state should just ensure is that the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights aligns with the UNGPs. You've mentioned many other standards, many other efforts, but we must be clear that the UNGPs represent the authoritative standard, you know, on what responsible states and businesses should do. So ensuring that in developing the National Action Plan, it aligns. And even on our website in the working group, there is a list of countries with their National Action Plan. So states can learn from what other countries have done. By just going on the website, you'll see, you'll be able to download the National Action Plans of other countries. And Switzerland recently released the National Action Plan just a few days ago. So there are lessons from there. So when states do this, then the businesses will know exactly what is expected of them. And in doing so, states should also ensure that the process is consultative. You get the opinion of civil society, opinion of academia, opinion of businesses themselves. You get the opinion of all stakeholders so that it will reflect the national value and the national aspiration. So that would be my advice to states.
And Christelle, would you agree, also in your opinion, is that the most pressing issue sort of specific to the MENA region?
Thank you. Allow me to disagree, even though I'm fully aligned with what Dr. Damilola says, but from a practitioner standpoint, I must disagree from an operational standpoint. Why? Because let's not forget that if today businesses were to, if we're, as you were as you were saying, Philip, there's different types of businesses in the Middle East, right? So we have the Middle Eastern businesses and we have the foreign businesses. What I also would like to add to this distinction and the separation is that we tend to also put all the Middle Eastern economies in one bucket. There is different types of economies in the Middle East. We have the thriving economies, the GCC countries, we have Morocco, we have Egypt, we have sort of, the developing economies, but we also have countries that are in conflict. We're talking about Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. These are countries in the Middle East as well, which business is nowhere to be compared to what is happening elsewhere. So I think that it's very important to also distinguish that. And going back to Dr. Damilola's point, is obviously National Action Plan and the government's sort of tone, setting the tone of what's expected of businesses is very important, especially to level the playing field. However, if we're looking at things in practice now, for foreign businesses, it's a complete legal maze. It's important to say is that even if we come as a foreign company and we say, okay, we want to apply the UN guiding principles, it sometimes there are things that doesn't match. Local laws are contradiction with the UN guiding principles or other standards that, like for example, in labor law or gender and diversity or things like that. We are in contradiction, and then you find these companies on one hand needing to comply with local laws because they should, and on the other hand coming in with the mandatory and reporting obligations where they need to report back on what they've done to sort of push the agenda. So from a practical standpoint, national action plans are great, but I think what we need to do is much more operational. So before we sort of, I guess, paint the businesses as the bad guys, we also need to all understand the difficulties they're having to face on the ground. In other words, if today we were a sustainable business in the Middle East, we pay workers fairly and with wages, etc., we're more expensive. And this is not a competitive advantage. So being a sustainable business today in the Middle East is not a competitive advantage. And then businesses are finding themselves being kicked out of the market because of that. So it's looking at all of this dynamic from an operational standpoint to say, okay, and in my view, Dr. Damilola, for me, what a first step also for governments would be is to create financial incentive. I'm a Middle Eastern or MENA-based business, Middle Eastern because MENA-based business, foreign or local. If I want to be sustainable, you need to, tax reduction, etc. Allow me to thrive as a sustainable business in a very difficult environment.
I mean, so obviously, I think that's the basic issue, right? That enterprises and businesses have. It's costly to abide by all these measures and laws. And if you want to do it right, if you want to do it just, if you want to be fair, if you want to apply all human rights, it takes strength. It takes a lot of energy and money. Obviously, money that you lose elsewhere. Damilola, would you agree that there isn't enough financial kind of incentives, that incentives is a key aspect that in the Middle East and North Africa in particular, we need to promote and strengthen? And I'd like to add a kind of a second question to that one. You mentioned the third pillar of remedies. Are those somehow intertwined? I mean, because accountability and kind of offering remedies is also a sort of negative incentive, right? It's something that you don't want to have to do. So how would you combine those two topics?
Thank you very much. In fact, I think myself and Christel are basically saying the same thing, because like I said, if you speak to businesses, they tell you, this is our account. This is what we expect. And some of the things Christel said are exactly the things we hear from businesses, that, it's not just enough to say, to have a document that says we should do this and that. You must make the regulatory environment to be supportive of us to be able to implement this. And that's very correct. Now, that is why I said the process of developing the National Action Plan itself should be with the consultation of businesses. They know better what is practicable. What is in the National Action Plan of Switzerland may not work in a MENA country because the contexts are just quite different. So that is why that multi-stakeholder perspective in developing a National Action Plan is very, very important. Now, what do businesses want? Businesses want a situation whereby they can access global markets. They can be competitive. They can ensure that their goods and services are acceptable. Now, we all have no one wants to consume goods that is made of from child labor or from modern slavery. So what we must understand is that for businesses, it is already an incentive to ensure that your goods and services are acceptable to global markets. If you're selling, even if you are a one-person shop making pancakes, you want to be sure that your customers will not leave you when they hear that your pancakes are made out of forced labor, right? So I think compliance and ensuring alignment is already an incentive. It's a win-win. It's a win for businesses because they would have, they will be able to have much more loyalty to their brands. It's a win for them because they would have, they will be able to access European markets with the CS-DDD saying we will no longer accept goods made from forced labor. If they comply, they will be able to access global markets. It's a win for businesses because when they respect labor rights, they would have a talented and motivated workforce that feel respected as humans with their dignity intact. So they will put in their best. So businesses should not think incentives is all about providing an innovation fund whereby they can be given money to comply. They should understand that there is a strong business case in terms of reputation, in terms of risk management, in terms of ability to access global markets for them to comply. That said, part of the process, many states in the MENA region are looking to promote entrepreneurship. You have, for example, the Qatar National Vision, which talks about promoting entrepreneurship. You have the Oman National Vision, and you have national visions, that specifically mention the need to promote entrepreneurship. So that incentive is already there. So the states many of the states that have released these national visions, they are already saying we want to promote entrepreneurship, innovation. We want SMEs to become global brands. We want to transition to a knowledge-based economy whereby goods made from here will be accepted. I will be able to go to Geneva and find my favorite O'Malley or my snack that I will buy in the region. For us to achieve that, for the goods to be competitive in line with those national visions, then human rights has to be not just a central aspect of that entrepreneurship. So providing the knowledge, the awareness, and that's why I think what we're doing today in terms of promoting awareness to businesses on why they should align with the UNGPs is a very, very strong contribution.
I'd like to wrap it up. Time flies by when you're having fun, and I think all viewers, including myself, are now hungry for pancakes, if I may say so. But I'd like to ask both of you as a final question, or as a final word also, what is your vision for business and human rights for the region? Where do you think we'll be in, say, 3 to 5 years? Maybe we'll start with you again, Christelle, and then Damilola.
Thank you. So I think it's as Dr. Damilola was just saying, the Middle East is like there's this strong momentum even for countries that are in conflict. Things are rapidly shifting in the Middle East. They will eventually become post-conflict, hopefully, and in that sense, we will want to be optimistic, right? And even developing countries where there is push for innovation, for sustainability also. The sustainability agenda is pretty strong in the Middle East now. And what I would say is that also based on what Damilola says, understanding the Middle Eastern context is very important because we also have a very strong legacy of family-owned businesses and SMEs. And when it comes to reputational risk, as you were alluding to, it's very personal, actually. And so it's not just about risk to the business, it's taken very personally. And I think businesses in the Middle East want to do good. And it's family ties and it's these strong relationships you build with your workforce and your employees, etc., that goes beyond the standard business, operations. And I think understanding this context actually helps the business and human rights agenda, because it's just easier to navigate the situation and the risks and etc. It's easier to get it on board, and then it's easier for the business to embed it as internally in their processes. And I think what also I see is that businesses are slowly also waking up to the fact that stakeholders are actually partners. They're starting to realize that there's a force in engaging, outside just the boardroom, so to speak. So I'm very hopeful and optimistic about the next steps in the Middle East when it comes to business and human rights.
Thank you very much. I think what I would like to emphasize is that the business and human rights agenda is a call for win-win solutions. A win for businesses in terms of unlocking new technologies, accessing global markets, unlocking clean and sustainable entrepreneurial solutions, and which will be a win for human rights, right? So all sides must see this agenda as an opportunity to unlock win-win solutions that advance human rights and advance sustainability, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And to have win-win solutions, all stakeholders must be seen on board. All stakeholders. There should be no intimidation. There should be no reprisals. There should be no attempt to pick one person or one side as the bad side. Because if you really want win-win solutions, all stakeholders must feel comfortable to discuss what will work in our context. And our work as the working group is to look for success stories. What has worked? And then we elevate those success stories and show the world that, wow, look at what is being done here in Nairobi, or whether it's in Oman, or whether it's in, to say this is the success story. So we stay ready to support the process. And I think education awareness is important. I think all universities, higher education institutions should devote resources and time to promote courses on business and human rights, to promote that education, so that all stakeholders in ministries, in government, in civil society will know exactly what they can do. We need to train the next generation to understand this concept. And so the working group stands ready to support all stakeholders to evolve these win-win solutions.
Thank you both. Thank you for taking the time and sharing your expertise with us on business and human rights.
Thank you for having us.